Hello, I'm Adrian Hyde of Adrian Hyde Photography, and today I'm going to do a little overview on the exposure triangle. So the exposure triangle, what is that? Now this is how we calculate an exposure, and in any exposure there are three elements. There is ISO, aperture and shutter speed. ISO is simply how sensitive your sensor is to the light that's coming into it. The lower the number, the less sensitive. The higher the number, the more sensitive it is, but be aware that the higher you go, the more chance you can have digital noise coming into your photos. Let's have a quick look to see how it all starts. The ISO is measured in stops, as is everything else in photography. So if you hear about us going one stop up or one stop down, I will only be talking about whole stops because there are thirds of stops as well. As ISO, we talk about stops of ISO. So most cameras nowadays, they start at either 100 or 200 ISO. So if we start at 100, one stop up from that will be 200 ISO. Another stop up from that will be 400. Another stop up will be 800. Then 1600, 3200, 64, and sometimes 128. Now, if we start here, the light sensitivity is quite slow, but it's the best quality you're going to get. As you go through, depending on your camera manufacturer, you're going to see more noise in your images. Next, I want to talk about the f-stops. Now, the f-stop is quite simply the hole in your lens. If we start off very, very small like this, this is a very, very small one, which would be a very, very high number. And this, when it's wide open like this, is a very, very low number. Okay, so it's low, high. When we talk about the lens being wide open or very, very fast, it's at the widest point. And when we talk about a slower lens, or we want less light in, then it's a smaller hole. Okay, so when the lens is wide open, like this, it's going to be a low number. So we start in f2.8. There is some other stops before that, but generally most lenses, the most fast lenses, they start around about 2.8. Sometimes with primes they are a little bit before that. But we're looking at 2.8. Next stop up is f4. Next stop up is 5.6. Now every stop going here, the hole is getting smaller. So there's then less light in, so it's becoming slower. f5.6, f8. Next one up, f11, f16, f22, and f32. The f-stop in your camera, the hole, also affects the depth of field. Now, if you don't know what the depth of field is, this is quite simply how much is in focus in your photo. So if you want a large depth of field, you are going to be going around about here. f16, f22, f11. It's going to be a very, very large depth of field. This is going to be all in focus. If you want to go to the other extreme, then you're going to need a very, very low number, and you're going to be shooting open like this. So, you know, f2.8, ff4, around about here. And that's a very, very shallow depth of field. Moving on to the shutter speed. Now, the shutter speed is quite simply how long the shutter is open for. And we can have different effects of that as well. So, if we have a very, very fast shutter speed, the action is going to be frozen. If, on the other hand, the shutter speed is very, very slow, it's going to be blurred if it's moving. So we are going to start here at the faster end. Start here at the faster end. the shutter speed, say 1000. Next stop down will be 500, 250th, next stop down 125th, 60th, 30th, 15th, 8th, 4th, half a second and a whole second. So that briefly explains what the ISO, f-stop and shutter speed does. Now for this next bit we're going to start a little bit of number crunching. So for argument's sake, for our perfect exposure we're going to use the perfect 10. There's perfect 10. Now the perfect 10. There are many ways to make 10, but we've got 3 elements. And just for an example, just using some numbers, how can we make 10 just using 3 elements? Well, we can use 4, 5, and 1 will make 10. We could go, I'm going to do 3 of these just to give you an example. So you have 2, 1, guess what the next one is going to be? 7. Make the perfect 10. We then have 3, 4, and 3. Also making a perfect 10. So as you can see, we've got a perfect 10 here. Now 1, 5 and 4 may be something completely different to 3, 3 and 4. We still come out at 10. So as we've got 3 elements here, 1, 2 and 3, we are going to change these and just call them 1, 2 and 3. We're going to give them names, so one's going to be ISO. One is going to be our f-stop, and one is going to be our shutter speed. Now, what we did earlier on, I explained earlier on, the ISO, the f-stop and the shutter speed, they all do different things. So this combination of numbers here will have different exposures, although it's all exposed correctly. So this one here, number 1, let's say for argument's sake, will not be grainy. It'll have a reasonable depth of field and the shutter speed will be also medium. If you look to here, we've got a more grainier photo, a very, very narrow depth of field on this one, and a very, very sharp, fast shutter speed. This one is slightly higher ISO, so a little bit more grainier. This one is a slightly bigger depth of field, and it's a mediocre shutter speed. Just as a little bit of fun. But let's put some proper numbers to this now. So you've been out, you've taken your first photo in full program mode, matrix of everything in the camera is automatic. You don't have to worry about a thing. But we need to start understanding what these numbers are. So for our perfect 10 exposure again, our perfect 10 exposure, if we had the camera set and it's come out with this, it just spat these numbers out. If we had an ISO of 400, an f-stop of f8, and a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, and it's a perfect exposure. A perfect 10. So taking our photo, we've now got our camera settings. But there's a problem. The problem is the photo's blurred. So what are we going to do? With our perfect 10 exposure, and the photo being blurred. Because it was in full program mode, the camera, as far as it's concerned, has done its job. But the camera sometimes is a little bit silly because it doesn't fully understand what the photographer wants. So we have to tell it really what to do. But we were a good starting point because we got a perfect 10 exposure. So the answer is we can put it into shutter priority mode, or we can really get our feet wet and put it into full manual. Now, using these settings here, our 400 f8 1/60th gives us a perfect exposure. So if we want to put, we want to freeze the action more and we want to put it up one stop, we can put it into shutter priority, and then the camera will do the rest. It will figure it all out. So put it in camera priority, 1/60th a second, put it up. You want it faster, put it up to 1/60th, either 1/25th or 1/250th of a second. And that should solve the issue. But if you want to go the whole hog and shoot it in manual, then this is what we do. So you're taking your first steps now out of full program mode, and you've now started to use the semi-automatic modes. There are two of these. There are aperture priority and shutter priority. But really what we should do is come out of those semi-automatic modes, although there are times when you need those for shooting, and go into full manual. So in your full manual mode, you look down at your camera and you can see this little light meter. Now, the in-camera light meter is pretty good, it's pretty accurate. There are 3 modes you need to be aware of that it will meter for, and that is matrix, which is for all of the scene. It evaluates the whole scene. There's center weighted, which is a little bit here, and then there is spot meter, which is little spots of where you need to meter it. And depending on which meter mode you're in, will give you different results. And this is the example of what your typical in-camera meter will look like. It'll be a bar here, and they have little dots on. This is your perfect exposure here, or what your camera thinks to be perfect. And these are third of stops down, and then you'll have a little one here, which is slightly smaller than a big one here. That's a whole stop down. Now, what happens if you have your camera light meter is reading here? So you had a quick look at your camera meter, and it's here. It's one stop too light. So what do you want to do with it? Well, it's not the end of the world. You can easily move this. So it's one stop too light. So if we're going to use these examples here, we want to make it darker. So if you want to make it darker by one stop, the shutter speed will be needed to go quicker. So that'd be 1/25th of a second. This needs to be darker, so you need to close that hole up a little bit. This would also make the depth of field bigger, f8, or we want to make it darker, we could then turn this down by one stop to make it ISO 200. Now, the next bit. So before you start moving any of these, there's some questions you must ask yourself before you give a priority to one of these that you moved. So the questions to ask yourself. Now, do you want to freeze, or do you want to show the movement? And that would be under your shutter speed here. How much do you want in focus of the photo? Do you want it a lot in focus or not so much in focus? And that is this here. And how sensitive is the sensor? How much digital noise do you need to show or not show, or with some modern day cameras, you can go very, very high. It doesn't really make much difference, but it does make a difference. So depending on what the answer is to that question, you would either alter the shutter speed, alter the f-stop, or alter the ISO. So this is where it might get a little bit complicated now. You want to come down one stop here. One stop here. And you have to alter one of these. So for this next photo, I want a very, very shallow depth of field. I want the shallowest I can get. So at the moment, it's a very, very wide depth of field, and a lot of the photo is in focus, and I don't want that. I only want a very, very little bit. So this means that I want a very, very low aperture or a very, very big hole. I want to be somewhere around here. f2.8 I want to get to. Right, f2.8, we're starting off f8, f2.8, that's 1, 2, that's 3 stops down. I want to take away 3 stops, plus the one it was already over. So that's 4 stops I need to take away to get to my exposure that I actually need. So 4 stops. We'll take this down, 4 stops, f2.8. Now, because at f2.8, if I leave all the settings as they are at the moment, the photo is going to be very, very, very bright and white. And we've got to lose 4 stops of light. So we can lose 2 very, very easily with the ISO from 400 to 200 to 100. So we'll put 100 ISO. Yeah. Move that out of the way. And we've now got 2 more stops of light to find. So f60th, we want to make the photo darker. So darker is faster because the shutter speed is going quicker. So we're at 1/60th, 1/25th, and 1/200th of a second. And that will give us our perfect 10 in the middle on this example here. So I'm going to leave that there now. If you want to become a better photographer, then you're going to have to sit down, you're going to have to learn this stuff, because the cameras nowadays, they are brilliant, but they're only brilliant up to a certain point. You need to know how the ISO works in relation with the f-stops and with the shutter speed. Once you understand how they all work, how they all interact with each other, then you're going to be in a far, far better place and take far better photos. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye for now.